In his March State of the Union address, President Biden reported that tens of thousands of clean energy jobs were being created by his climate agenda. The goal was laudable, but was it achievable? As of that time, the $7.5 billion allocated in the bipartisan infrastructure bill to EV charging stations had produced only 8 charging plazas out of the 500,000 plazas these jobs were meant to create. That's because it takes time for states to put together plans for the use of these funds. And that general topic of process is a very important one here tonight. Likewise, of the $1.6 billion designated to replace the 60-year-old Brent Spence Bridge that spans the Ohio River between Ohio and Kentucky, only $15.7 million has been spent. So, of course, as you heard, I have some experience in bridge replacement, and ever since I completed the procurement for the Tappan Zee Bridge, I have been doing briefings and op-eds about what private sector expertise can bring to large public works projects. That's why I was really pleased when the City Journal wanted to publish a case study on the Tappan Zee project, the largest infrastructure project at its time. It's also the reason that I'm so pleased to sponsor Manhattan Institute's Innovation in Infrastructure program. Manhattan Institute is absolutely the right address for a program like this. John Ketchum has assembled a distinguished group of thinkers who have produced timely and relevant papers that will give us much food for thought. You'll be hearing from 4 of them, who he mentioned earlier: Kirk Steidel, former director of Michigan Department of Transportation; Stephen Polzin, research professor, Transportation, Arizona State University; Mike Wooten, former administrator for the Federal Procurement Policy, fellow National Academy of Public Administration; Judge Glock, director in research and senior fellow, Manhattan Institute. The Manhattan Institute has also attracted the right audience to hear their papers. This audience of former and current infrastructure officials, academics, policy experts, and transportation advocates are in a position to convert thought into action. The entrepreneurial instincts that are so ingrained into the running of a private business can add a great deal of value to public infrastructure contracting. In the case of the Tappan Zee replacement, the complex environmental review process and historic design-build procurement was completed in less than 1 year. At the outset, the estimate for the new bridge was $5.4 billion, but our procurement came in at nearly $2 billion below the original estimate and was way ahead of schedule. As the process unfolded, I realized that this bridge replacement was an opportunity to create a new model of modernizing the nation's infrastructure. When we think about infrastructure bills and spending, we often act as if money is the only variable. It isn't, and it may not even be the most important variable. It's not how much you spend, but how you spend it. We need processes that are smooth, rational, efficient, and not mired in out-of-date practices. To that end, the private sector can offer important lessons for massive public works projects. I'd like to briefly highlight a few of these lessons from my New York State Thruway Authority experience. I'm not going to spend your time going into detail because you can read about that in the case studies and hear them in my fireside chat with John. I'll just share a few nuggets here. Lesson number 1, public dollars and the public trust deserve respect. I'm guided by 4 simple principles that apply to the 4 stakeholders in large-scale public projects. Those who pay for it, the hardworking taxpayers, deserve to know their dollars are being spent responsibly. Those who spend it, the government, should act with accountability and transparency. Those who build it, the contractors, should operate with efficiency and integrity. And lastly, the results should be measurable and effective. Before I took the helm at the New York State Thruway Authority, I had the same preconceptions about civil service employees that many private sector people do. We see government as inefficient and the civil service as a place of people who couldn't make it in the private sector, people who are counting the days to retirement and their generous pensions. What I found instead were highly qualified, seasoned professionals who were struggling to do a job in a system that cheapens their work and disincentivizes them while punishing risk-taking and innovation. Entrepreneurial instincts are so ingrained in the running of a private business that they're practically muscle memory. They can help guide the process in ways that complement the highly talented government experts tasked with giant civil engineering projects. Lesson 3, civil service employees are as skilled as private sector employees, but they're taken for granted by both public and government. They deserve recognition and incentives. I was shocked to find out that there were civil service workers who had served for decades but had never received any recognition. That's because the civil service doesn't have access to the kinds of rewards that we offer in the private sector. So I did a very simple thing. For the holidays in 2011, I ordered an embossed chocolate coin for each of the 3,200 New York State Thruway associates and employees. I sent it with holiday greetings from me as chairman. And one day I passed the desk of one of our longtime employees. I noticed she hadn't eaten her chocolate, and she had it pinned up on the board. And I asked her why. I was concerned it was getting stale. She said because she wanted to keep it and look at it, because it was the first time in 40 years that anyone had given her any recognition at all. Meaningful progress requires constant vigilance. You have to ask questions, demand answers, and reject business as usual. Right from the beginning, our focus was on total time and total cost. So one of my first questions was, why does the Tappan Zee Bridge have to be located where the Hudson River spans through more than 3 miles across? Why can't we build a new bridge in a different location where the river is only a mile or so? Well, the Regional Plan Association gave me a good history lesson and all the reasons, both good and bad. The bridge is where it is, and we had to go with that, and we would have to follow the same way. Lesson 5, time is, let's see. Seem to be skipping some of these lessons, but you'll get the idea. Lesson 5, time is money. In infrastructure projects, keep the process moving in order to save money and avoid delays. As a builder and developer, I knew that risk increases exponentially with time. A failure to apply a business-like discipline to civic affairs, a failure to dig in, understand a problem, and resolve it, all of these could cost the communities around us in very real ways. We used high technology and analytics to address high accident locations to improve public safety. We moved to an all-electronic toll system. This improved productivity and the driver experience while reducing congestion in metropolitan areas. So you now see those tolls where there's no toll booths and just an electronic record of who passed by when they manage to find you if you haven't bought your Easy Pass. In partnership with Cornell University, we discovered innovative nano-based resurfacing materials that can extend the life of our roads, in this case up to 10 times. This nanoclay, now being field tested, has the potential to save New York State and the nation billions of dollars in repair costs annually. We engaged local schools in the Rockland area, hoping to inspire the next generation of civil engineers, infrastructure planners, and those who will devote themselves to civic responsibility. Lesson 6, get a long warranty from your builders. A lot of you are aware that the New York State Thruway Authority is suing the builders of the new bridge to pay for retrofitting 61 of the 992 cables that support the span. The procurement was obtained during my tenure as chair, but the construction took place after I left. It's possible that changes were made to the specs to which I would not have agreed, but the 100-year warranty we negotiated is in place to protect against just such problems. The innovations described in the case study are all well and good, but some of them required special legislation that has now expired, making the use of the others, such as nanoclay for road surfacing, require changing the specs in RFPs. RFPs are often wedded to old technologies, and methods that decrease the life of infrastructure projects. But there are other issues as well. When it comes to a massive infusion of funds like the one we're seeing from the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the pacing of projects is everything. The need is great, but the available of builders is limited. As an example, when it comes to bridges, there are many that need repair and rebuilding, but there are only a handful of qualified bridge builders available, and they're tied up in massive projects already. This is a matter of capacity to undertake the work that the funds are meant to cover. These are some of the issues that I hope the Innovation in Infrastructure program will tackle. The bipartisan infrastructure bill has given us a once-in-a-century opportunity. We count on the wisdom and guidance of those of you in this room today to ensure that we make the most of it. Thank you. So this is the Q&A. Oh, John is the Q person. I'm supposedly the A person.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Milstein, for sharing those invaluable insights with us. So let's just start at the beginning. So 2011, you were named as chairman of the Thruway Authority. You had experience in the private sector as a builder, but you never built a bridge, right? But the interesting thing was, nor had the Thruway Authority in the 50-plus years since the Tappan Zee Bridge. And so there was a loss of institutional capability. And so I'm wondering, just to situate us, what did your private sector experience prepare you for in your role as chairman? And then what did you have to learn about how government works along the way?
Well, there were lots of lessons along the way, not the least of which is I started out with an advantage in the lingo of construction. So when I met with all the competitors, I understood their frame of mind and what their objectives were and what their hot buttons would be. But the flip side of that was we ended up doing something that, to my knowledge, hasn't been done anywhere else, which was to get input from them. Because I had exactly that conversation with our engineering staff. And I said to them, we've issued the specs, but these 4 bidding groups build all the bridges built in the world. And so they may know a little bit more about this than we do. And I could see a few people were a little uncomfortable with that. And I said, well, how many bridges have we built in the last 5 years? None. How many have we built in the last 10 years? None. And then we ended up finally getting to John's number of, in 5 decades or 6 decades, we never built a bridge. So they sort of were a little, they didn't want to let the fox into the hen house, so to speak. And they were a little leery of this, but I said, here's what I want to do. There was a 10-week bidding process. I said, each week I want our senior engineering team to meet with the 4 competitors alone and ask them if there's any way to improve what we're doing. And they said, well, what are we going to do with that information? I said, well, what we do is if we can get all 4 competitors to agree on something, a change in the RFP that will benefit us in terms of value creation or extended life, we should consider it. And if all 4 agree, I mean, certainly each one will make some suggestion that plays into their strengths. But after taking that into account and neutralizing it by getting all the other 3 competitors, if that can be done, that's very useful. And there came a day when I got a phone call that said there's a crisis. I said, what's the crisis? Well, the second floor has not approved any toll increases, and so the second floor being the governor's office in Albany. So we didn't have any direction in Albany as to what they should do because the contractors who were spending about $500,000 a week preparing their bid were saying they were going to stop work because there's nobody to pay for it. Now, it's true I had an ace in the hole in dealing with this, but I wasn't sure how it would work. So I called and so I said to I had a monitor. I had the federal procurement person who knew the rule book of federal procurements, which, you know, got to keep it up and up. So I had him there, and I said I have to meet with the contractors. He said, well, you can't meet with the contractors. I said, why not? I said, if I don't meet with them, they've stopped working, we're not going to have a bridge. He said, well, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to tell them that they'll have the money. And I have some credibility in that area. They know me now. And so I met with them, and I said, you know, told them my experience in building and kind of things that they would be interested in. And after 2 sentences, they said, okay, we'll go back to work. So I, of course, did not miss an opportunity to again ask them, is there anything that we could be doing different to create more value in any of these aspects? And each one of them basically said the same thing, which is they were sure that we were going to get the best value that anybody ever got, because nobody ever asked them this question. And so the things they learn on all their projects don't get incorporated because it's too cumbersome to try to change the RFPs. And that, in fact, is what happened. And so I don't know if I'm skipping over too much of your question, but what ended up happening was the bridge that Governor Cuomo called me and said, we have to be able to do it within this budget of $5.4 billion. And I said, well, how am I supposed to figure that out? He said, well, you know about construction. So I called my friends, and they told me you got to get design build. Got design build. 11 months later, we gave out the contract, and it wasn't $5.4 billion. I called the governor back and said, we could do this for $4 billion or less. And he said, well, in the U.S. Transportation Department thinks it's $5.4 billion. And the big dig in Boston, we were supposed to cost $6 billion, but it's up to $28 billion. I just need to know that we can bring this in, you know, at some kind of budget. So you don't have to say $4 billion, as long as we could be $5.4 billion. I said, no, we could do it $4 billion or less. That's what I believe. He said, okay, go to work. So we did. We gave out the contract for $3.2 billion. So just think about this. So you have a person who's not experienced, to say the least, in bridge building or public contracting. That's 40% less. The time I did the calculation, 40% of the U.S. government budget was more than the amount of the deficit. So if we did, of course not everything is a bridge procurement, but if you had that kind of savings from asking these simple business questions, such as how can we improve on what we're doing, you could have dramatic results. Now, did I skip over anything?
Oh, no, that was great. Thank you, Mr. Milstein. I wonder, just for the edification of some of our guests, so how was design build different from the prevailing system used in New York, design bid build, and why did it yield such substantial savings?
So let me just say one name, Calatrava. For those who know, the system that exists separate normally in government is there's a contest, a beauty contest. So an architect puts together his dream, working with some engineers, of what the project should be. And after they decide exactly what it should look like, whether anybody has ever built anything that looks like this before, they then take that and they bid out, what does it cost to build this thing? Now, Calatrava built the downtown, designed a magnificent transit point for the PATH subways. Is that what it's? Yeah. And, but it leaks. I think Frank Lloyd Wright had this problem quite a bit too. But yeah, so you're building things that no one has built before using what we call in the construction trade specials. In other words, actually a building that I built in New York had a provision that they wanted, the architects had designed acoustical ceiling tiles instead of 12-inch by 12-inch, 11 1/4 inch by 11 1/4 inch. So the off-the-shelf supply that happened to be an Italian producer had, the off-the-shelf thing, we couldn't use that, no. Had to use the other thing. And the way this happened to me is I had partners who had given out this contract because the architect was somehow socially engaged with them, or someone's son-in-law. And of course, I never imagined they'd be designing 11 1/4 inch tiles. Well, I talked about time increasing risk exponentially. Now, think of the possibilities. It's an Italian manufacturer. It's a special. What has happened? It's in Italy. A strike. How long did the strike? So we couldn't finish the lobby of the building for over a year after it was open because we couldn't get the the right tile. So I think there's that. Have we covered the topic?
Yes, thank you. Didn't even work out with the centimeters to inches difference with the Italians.
That if it had arrived, then it had been the wrong size because of the center. That could have happened.
Another year.
That's one thing that didn't happen.
Thank goodness. Well, so on the one hand, you say that you've had to work with lots of folks in government who you found diligent and capable, but then you also had to work with many of the design builders' employees as well. So could you talk to us about how those interactions went and how you approached those differently, you know, those under your department and those who are working for you?
Okay, so I interrupted my own train of thought in discussing this issue as to who I dealt with. So my monitor, my federal monitor, said you cannot meet these people because if you do, you cannot vote on the project. I said, well, if I don't meet with these people, we'll have no bridge, so we won't have to worry about any vote on the project. And so I'm pretty confident that my board will follow along and do what makes sense. But keep in mind, I'm giving these people my assurance, my personal assurance, that this will be a real project that will get paid for and have money for. So that was the only meeting I had personally with the contractors, and all four were present. But they did meet with our engineering staff regularly. There were 4 meetings every week. And I would get, you know, kind of summaries of those meetings. So I kept track of it, but it was done by our people who were there. They knew how to do it. All they just needed was, okay, should we do that? Yeah. In fact, the question of should we do it is a very big question in public contracting. And in my remarks, I think I may have touched on fixing problems in the as they develop or they are found in accidents being occurred by perhaps the design of the road. Perhaps at a certain time of day, the sun is going directly into their eyes. And I became aware of this because, you know, when I became chairman of the Thruway Authority, I had friends who got stuck in traffic on exit 18 coming into New York, and they had nothing to do, so they would call me and say, you know, there's a delay here. And I got enough of those things. I saw that there was basically a delay on exit 18 from an accident every day. And luckily I didn't have too many friends. But I heard it enough to figure out, well, we should do something. So I would gather once a month my entire senior staff to talk about things they were doing, things that they, you know, were stumped by, anything they wanted to talk about. So I laid out, gave him this example of the sun being, I said, maybe it's the way the lane feeds into the merge lane, and maybe it's a physical condition. And they said, they asked me a question that I wasn't sure why they were asking. They said, well, would you do something about it if you found out it was a physical problem? I said, of course. I said, if it's something that could be done for $1 million or less, we'll just do it right away. I mean, keep in mind, this is something that's listed causing accidents and deaths. And so I'll do that. If it's going to be, you know, 50 or 100 million, we'll have to put it into our capital budget and have to go through a process, but we'll start to cure the problem. They said, we're very relieved. because we didn't want to have the answer to this question and not do it. It would create legal liability for us. So I said, no, we'll do it. And so that's my dealing, how I dealt with, I really, except for that one meeting I had, I dealt through my staff, through the senior people, who were all talented. It's not like these people didn't know their business. They absolutely knew their business. At one board meeting, this is all on tape because it's, public meetings, the fellow said to me, the fellow who was responsible for converting the toll booths into drive-throughs. So think of it, every car has to stop. Some have exact change, some have to get change, some drop their credit card on the floor. It's primitive. That's not what we want to have. People can go 55 miles an hour and not stop. I said, can you imagine the millions of man hours that you'd be saving? So in front of the public, the fellow responsible for this project, I said to him, how long is it going to take for us to replace all the tolls that we have with the drive-throughs? He said, 5 years. I said, if it takes 5 years, you're not going to be here. I literally said that. He said, don't worry, I just thought it was an outside date. I said, okay, as long as it's very far outside. So, you have to have a certain amount of drive to do better. Seems like the most basic kind of an idea, but in the public sector, the risk of having done something wrong puts a lot of things, at least in the delay lane, if not in the can't do it lane.
Right. And that's why it's so critical to have motivated your staff to want to be there, to have that morale that they're making an impact and they're doing good, important work.
I'll give you another example. So one of these sessions, our trucks, they said we have to replace our entire truck fleet. I said, why? And they said, well, because they're all Mack trucks. They're built to last forever, but they don't make them anymore, and they don't make any replacements for them anymore. So I said, what do you recommend? They said, we sell our existing ones and let somebody else deal with them and get new ones. I said, will the new ones be as good as the old ones? They said, no, they won't be as good as the old ones. I said, well, why don't we do this? Since everybody is getting this same recommendation you're giving me, why don't we go into the aftermarket and buy up all the Mack trucks that are, just with a little fixing could be fixed, and just use them as a spare parts inventory. So these are the kinds of things that don't require any thought in the private sector. But when they heard about that, they said, oh yeah, that's a great idea. But I think that they're so beaten down by the process that they can barely do the things they must do. And so, but I think that all those people, and there were about, in those days, sitting around the room, maybe as many as 20, now know that type of thinking is a whole different thing. It's not hard to implement once you are familiar with it.
Right. And simply asking, are the new trucks better than the old trucks? I imagine that many folks who, would not ask to think that question, right? If the procedure is simply, well, we need new trucks. Right? Now, on the theme of public value, what's remarkable about the Tappan Zee Bridge is that it was spared from the egregious costs, overages, and the delays that affect New York's transit and New York's infrastructure projects. How did the contract incentivize the design builder to get the job done on time and deliver that public value?
Now, this is an elaboration of one of your other questions that you mentioned that I didn't get to the answer. So let's see, where do I begin on this one? How do we make a start? Okay, so the essence of design build is you're going to avoid a dispute between the architect and engineer. The architect saying, we can't build what the engineer designed, or the engineer says we can't build what the architect designed. And if we go back to the Calatrava example, that certainly was the case, that they both blamed each other. The engineer said, or the architect said, you didn't install it properly. So you have to start with eliminating this. The fellow who you're thinking you owes you money, no, it's the other fellow, and then there's a whole battle, and then they end up with the public authority because it has to work, has to basically pay more than it should for other people's mistakes. So if you want to avoid that, what you do is you build it into the contract that you've got a team that's bidding. It's not just an architect who, when someone wins a beauty contest and then someone tries to, get a contract to build it without, this is before they have any budget. But so you can see that what's wrong with that system, and it leads to architects, more so than engineers, but architects and engineers designing things without reference to how much they cost. Well, what do you think the result has to be? It has to be $5 billion instead of $3 billion. So it's just, and it's basically been done that way for, I don't know, 100 years. So that's really that's how you bring financial accountability to it, is you make the bidding group responsible financially. So in other words, the person who's designing it has to consult with the person who's going to build it, so that they end up saying, well, that'll cost too much because of X, Y, and Z, and it's not, it's nice, but we don't really need it. So in design, they're reducing costs.
Right, and you can't go and blame Calatrava for something that might be the construction company's mistake instead. So, yeah, on a similar theme, disputes are bound to come up in multi-billion-dollar projects. There was some back and forth on the Tappan Zee Bridge construction after your departure. As you mentioned, the sleeves for the cable anchors, some other disputes for bolts and for change orders. How did the contract anticipate this? It does have a dispute resolution mechanism built in, which is currently being utilized.
Which is an arbitration process.
Correct.
Or a legal process.
Correct.
So all of this is taken into account by having design build and a long guarantee of the work. So you've got the owner, in this case the public authority, and the contractors have a different interest. So the contractors, if you've done a good job with them in buying it, are basically not going to make a lot of money on that base contract price. But they're very good at saying, oh, well, this is your fault, or this wasn't included, except it was included. But if they can say it's not included, then they have a dispute, and then it has to get resolved, and they can get some more money out of it. So you have to understand the mentality. So that's what they're going to do in every case. We know that when they start out.
Right. It's gravy. They're going to angle for
right.
it.
Right. And so, a certain minor amount of this is, not the end of the world. But, I think that there was I think that the Thruway Authority, or the Bridge Authority now, determined that of nearly 200 cables that hold up the bridge, that 60 or 90 of them would not last the full 100 years. In other words, there's nothing wrong with them now, but they're not going to last. And so the authority went on offense and said, we want you to pay us now for the fact that it's not going to last as much as, of course, the easy comment to say is, well, let's see. And then they say, well, if the way we see is some cables dump cars into the Hudson, that's not going to work. Now, I don't know the details of the arbitration, but the authority is on very strong ground. But there's lots of things that happen that you would be amazed happen. So at one point, I'll give you an example of that. At one point, I got a call from our Buffalo office, and I was trying to take the board to each of our central offices all over the state. And they said they had to spend $160 million resurfacing a road. So I said, okay, let's have our next meeting in Buffalo, and we'll go take a look at the road. I said, this is not something you just say, okay, now we're spending $160 million. So we go there, and we've got our state police with their special hats, and and they've stopped all traffic because the chairman of the Thruway Authority is there, and I keep saying, don't stop the traffic for me. No, all this traffic has to be stopped, and I'm walking and I'm looking at the road.
Seems counterproductive to do that, right? I mean,
So I'm looking at the road, and it's got little tiny cracks in it and a little tar in the cracks, and it's flat. There's no potholes or anything like that. So I said to the fellow in charge of the Buffalo office, I said, have we been getting many complaints about this? And he says, no. I said, well, how many have we had? He says, none. I said, so why are we, who wants this? The contractors. I said, well, of course the contractors want it, but the contractors are so friendly with the people who are running the office that that's a good enough, oh, they want it. That's a good enough idea. But of course, it's really not a good enough idea. And we didn't add that to the capital project plan.
so before we open it up to audience Q&A, I'm wondering what you see as opportunities, right? We know that there's going to be a new incoming administration, different from the old. You've mentioned there are advances in materials science that could be brought to bear, but for some legislative changes. What do you see as some of the future possibilities in the space to bring innovation and infrastructure to life?
Well, I'll give you a bit of good news, and then I'll give you less good news. I'm not going to call it bad news, but it's definitely less good. The good news is I was in one of my meetings with the 20 people, one of my monthly meetings, and I said, you know, the way we handle our roads is not helpful to extending the life of the roads. So we've got this stuff that we've been doing since the 1950s, which is we put down new asphalt or concrete, and we put it down, and then we put salt on it, which deteriorates it, and the snow and the cold and the contraction, and that makes it weaker, and that makes it, and then in the winter, after they put all the salt on everything, they take the snow plows out and they gouge the surface, and so every summer they fill in the potholes caused by our own gouging. I said, there's got to be a way that's, have we ever investigated nanotechnology? So I'm a Cornell trustee, so we have this, school of nanotechnology. I don't know if it's a whole school, but we have a building. And so I said, why don't we just ask them to do something? And they said, well, we don't have a budget for that. I said, well, that's okay, I'll pay for it. So I have my one of my foundations organized to pay whatever the cost is. I was helping my alma mater anyway. So
Good value.
yeah, so it's value all around. So he does this work, nanotechnology, that's the operating at the microscopic level of interactions between different chemicals and conditions. And so I said, let's find something that if you put it into the asphalt or the concrete, if you put it in there, and you put it in a cold environment, and a moist cold environment, and a salty cold environment, it gets stronger instead of getting weaker. They said, well, how would that work? I said, I don't know, you're the nanotechnology people, let's see if we can find something here. And lo and behold, now engineers think of the world in terms of strength and flexibility. Those are the two characteristics that substances could have. I learned all this through, so I don't know that much about it. But anyway, he said that one of them, on one of the metrics, it could last 5 times as long. And on the other metric, it could last 2 times as long. So I said, does that mean I multiply the 5 by the 2? He said, theoretically, yes. If you could produce, if you put in the substance that we found, it costs very little, you could extend the life of the asphalt by 10 times. So think of the interstate system, and you could make, if the interstate system lasted 10 times as long, the annual cost would be 1/10 of the cost of the interstate system. So that's currently being tested, and we had to move this forward a few different times, but yeah, that's still going on now, so it's 10 years later. But at least it's going on. Okay, yeah, so that's the good news. The bad news is, think of the electrical vehicle program, the whole program. The whole program, in retrospect, was not thought through very well, which is why American consumers don't want electric vehicles. So no one said, well, what if the dogs won't eat the dog food? What happens then? And what happens is a problem. So various American electrical vehicle manufacturers have said they're closed down. Ford lost $5 billion trying to have electric vehicles. And on distributors' lots all over America, there's a lot of electric vehicles. So the thought got past the reality. So wouldn't it be nice if we could have electric vehicles? Oh yeah, that would be great. But except the consumers don't think that. And they've got to buy. The dogs have to eat the dog food, otherwise it's no good. So that same type of thinking skipped over the problem that when we built the Tappan Zee Bridge, there were 4 consortia on the planet that were qualified to bid on this. All 4 bid. Maybe there were another 2 or 3 somewhere, but they somehow didn't want to bid. Well, okay, if that's what's going to happen, that there's only 4 to build this one project, how many projects could, in our case, Fluor Corp, as the lead contracting entity, how many bridges of this magnitude could Fluor Corp do at the same time? 3, 4? How many? Well, if you divide the amount of money available for infrastructure by the number of projects, you're talking 30,000 projects. Well, are there 30,000 contractors? You're not doing them all at the same time. In fact, there's no hope of doing all these simultaneously in parallel, or even anything remotely like it. So much worse than that, when the states finally get around to saying this is the project we want, okay, well there's 49 other states who are all saying that same thing. So we want to get it at a low price, so we want the contractors hungry for work. We don't want them saying, well, if you don't give me my price, I'll go to the state next door and get it. So the whole way it could be procured was not taken into account. The limitations of the pipeline were never taken into account. And it's just like, okay, we're going to build, X, except that the capacity in the country is, 1/100th of X. I mean, not even 1/10 of X. So maybe that's not actually the thing holding it up now, but that's one of the reasons why the electrical vehicle, 500 of them have not been built, or 492 have not been built. The other 8 have been built.
And just underscores the reason why productivity is so important. If we have so few contractors to fulfill this great demand, well, productivity can help us do that better. That anecdote reminds me of, President Obama's shovel-ready jobs. Remember that? Except that there's no such thing, right? He just couldn't. It didn't exist.
Well, President Obama came to an opening, a ribbon cutting for the. It was before the ribbon, maybe it was the start of the construction. And he said this is the largest infrastructure project in the nation. But, it goes back, there's a long tradition of contractors and public officials. It's the famous case of a mayor of New York who was being attacked by the press because he was giving all the contracts to his brother-in-law. And so...
Not Mayor Adams.
No, and when this was 100 years ago, or 140 years ago. And when they asked him, well, why are you doing this? He said, what's the point of being mayor if you can't give your brother-in-law contracts? That's a true story.
Well, hopefully we're looking for other reasons to be interested in infrastructure projects. Thank you, Mr. Milstein. Let's open it up to some Q&A. Thank you.
In the back row.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for the remarks and the interview, and I took the liberty of reading the case study, and there's a bunch of questions, some of which have been asked, but I want to zero in on something that you didn't mention in your lessons learned. I have a technology background, and these are huge capital-intensive processes, And even back in 2011, there were things like simulation software, building digital models, so you could test the optionality. and
CAD-CAM,
review things.
CAD-CAM.
Exactly, CAD-CAM, CAE. And so I was just asking you, was that a minor support role or a partnership in the way you decided to assess risk and trial different ways of both building and materials you use for construct? Is that incidental or central?
So it wasn't central to me. In fact, I'm not aware whether we used CAD-CAM in our engineering department. It seems to me we probably did. But for sure, the bidders all used it. So that was available, that knowledge was available, as you say, at that time, and it was pretty, well known. It wasn't in its infancy. It was well developed, and new generations of CAD-CAM were even better than we started with.
But your folks didn't review their submissions in that context?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, they may well have, but it's just no one ever mentioned it to me.
Other questions, please? Yes. In the aisle, I think there was a question. Yes, sir. Thank you.
You mentioned,
Yeah, you have to just be very close to it. Kiss it.
all right. I'm concerned with the fact that some wonderful ideas in construction efficiency, safety, and speed can be compromised if we don't keep in check certain institutions. I remember reading a few years ago Phil Plotch's book on the Second Avenue subway. And he noted that when Barcelona was building their subway, they had a tunnel machine, a wonderful machine, which worked very well, and it was operated by 7 employees. We had the same machine here, and it required 25 employees.
25 union employees.
Okay, I stand corrected, 25 union employees. So you obviously know my concern about institutions. To me, the government should be very much involved in making sure that these kinds of problems are kept in check, because there's no free lunch, as you've noted many times. So I don't know how to get around these. Perhaps more exposure by people such as yourself, the press, academia, Manhattan Institute will help, but it just shouldn't be allowed to be business as usual.
If I can just start off by saying, this is one of the goals of the Milstein Innovation and Infrastructure projects at the Manhattan Institute. We want to raise the salience of infrastructure so that ordinary citizens know what they're not getting. Know that, the extraordinary costs of New York's infrastructure, for example, means that they're not getting the subways, they're not getting the public parks, they're not getting the public goods that they deserve with their hard-earned tax dollars. And so we want to not only propose solutions to these problems, but also to put some public pressure to bear on our elected leaders who have simply allowed the status quo to continue for so many years unchecked, to the detriment of the public interest. And if Tuesday's elections meant anything, it meant a widespread dissatisfaction among many urbanites with the way that things have been run for far too long. Infrastructure, public safety are just two of many examples where we've dropped the ball in places like New York, and in many cases it's because of the special interest influences that dominate our politics, right? And so what are we to do to push back? Well, we're trying to do something at the Manhattan Institute, and this is the start of a years-long initiative, thanks to Mr. Milstein's support and to our generous donors, that hopes to move the needle in a positive and constructive direction, particularly now that we have a new presidential administration. Would you like to add anything to that?
No. You have to come back for the next lecture.
Yes, thank you. We have time for one more? Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Milstein. So we've got a lot of government investment in infrastructure coming in over the last for years, most of it unspent. We'll see to the extent that it's clawed back or not. But the new president-elect spoke during his campaign about $6 billion being spent on charging stations for those electric cars that nobody wants to buy, to build, 10 stations, and of course the man's given to hyperbole. But he is right, and other infrastructure projects like spending tens of billions of dollars to hook up rural houses to Wi-Fi, and none of them have been connected. It could have been done with Starlink. I was speaking with John recently, and he mentioned that there hasn't been a confirmed federal procurement officer in the OMB throughout the entire history of the Biden administration.
Yeah. He's the last,
We
Dr.
have-
Wooten is the last
we have
serving one, yes.
The eminent last serving one, Dr. Wooten, with us. How do we systematize the successes that you had at the state level on the much grander and more obstinate federal level? Do you think is one or two things that we could to eat the elephant one bite at a time, if you will?
Well, this gives me an opportunity to push one of my pet projects, which is called Required National Service. And it's not obvious, let me just say how these things are connected. So the battle lines are drawn. A lot of money's going to get spent. There are some people who could get that money or get more of it. They want to do that. So you've got the political entities, the private sector, you've got the public sector. So the public sector, in just general, just because it's not spending their own money, they're spending the public's money, are not going to be quite as careful on average as someone who's spending their own money. So you get this problem of how are you going to change that dynamic of there's the people who have a lot of money to spend and the people who are not particularly scrupulous at times, wanting to get more of it. So the only way to deal with this that I can think of is for Americans to have a sense of their responsibility as citizens. And that would solve a lot of other problems also that we have. But anyway, just on this one topic, well, I mean, I could say, well, you get a businessman who's, understands this situation, but, that would be like, I don't know, 20,000 businessmen taking a year or two off from everything. But they have to be honest. And there's human nature is getting in the way of some of this. Unfortunate. But I think if you're thinking about this realistically, you have to realize that that's a problem. And, it was my greatest joy to be able to do things better. That's for the public. But not everybody thinks that way. So, I think that's the problem. And so, but a long-term solution would be building in civic responsibility and other things as the norm, where there's no norm like that now. There's, I don't know, stuff out there, but not organized.
Which underscores the importance of bringing in dedicated, experienced folks from the private sector into government service to bring that wealth of knowledge and expertise that may not be present in institutional capacity. So with that, is there one more question? I think we have, but with that, I want to thank you, Mr. Milstein, for your public service and the dedication you brought, the focus on public value. I'm sure many of you, probably all of you, have driven across the Tappan Zee Bridge, now the Mario M. Cuomo Bridge, but after today, I think you might not ever see it the same way ever again. And we have Mr. Milstein, his team, and the good public servants that worked for him and after him to thank for that. Thank you.
Thank you.